Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Subscribe today at raneworldview.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for joining us. It's been nearly a year since the Afghan Taliban took control of Afghanistan. Its rule has not been without problems. The country's economy is in shambles, more than half of its people are facing starvation, and the Taliban remains mostly isolated on the world stage. Add to those, the Taliban has mounting security challenges in Afghanistan. Isaia Galace is here with details. He's RANE's global security analyst. Isaia, it's good to have you back on this podcast.
Great to be here.
Can you start with the basics? What is the current state of security and stability in Afghanistan?
So there has been somewhat of a reduction in violence in Afghanistan under Taliban rule, and much of that has to do with the fact that the Taliban and coalition forces were previously engaged in years of conflict. So the withdrawal of coalition forces and the Taliban's takeover has naturally resulted in some reduction in violence. That being said, the Taliban's flagship promise has long been its claimed ability to secure and stabilize the country, and since its most recent takeover, the Taliban have generally failed to do that. Now, there was a months-long reduction in violence, which coincided with Afghanistan's winter season, and that typically results in a depression in the country's fighting. But we've seen a significant increase in activity by Islamic State Khorasan Province, or ISKP, and anti-Taliban resistance forces in recent months. ISKP in particular is conducting major attacks in the country again, targeting religious minorities and the Taliban, primarily in Kabul, but also notably in northern Afghanistan, and bombings that have been claimed or are suspected of being conducted by Islamic State have killed over 100 people since April. Regarding anti-Taliban resistance forces, the most prominent of which is the National Resistance Front, the number of groups that are resisting the Taliban have grown since the Taliban's takeover, and most have carried out their pledge to engage in a spring offensive against the Taliban, primarily in the northeast. Now, these groups have claimed occasional clashes and harassments of Taliban forces in previous months, and they now appear to be more intent on challenging the Taliban's territorial control, and have claimed in some cases to have retaken villages or districts from the Taliban. But it's kind of difficult to verify whether these claims are true and how long they're able to maintain these gains, if at all, given the challenges of sourcing information in more rural areas where these groups generally operate. Also, the capabilities of these groups are still generally unclear, and so far they haven't really demonstrated effective coordination of their efforts. But regardless, both these actors are forcing the Taliban to deploy fighters to the north to deal with these escalations in violence.
How is the situation in Afghanistan affecting security in the larger region?
So one of the principal concerns for neighboring countries has been preventing the spillover of instability and violence from Afghanistan into their respective countries. So most neighboring countries are continuing to call for greater international assistance, some level of cooperation with the Taliban, and are even discussing economic projects in their efforts to promote stability. But there have been some recent developments that have increased their security concerns. For one thing, Islamic State has long voiced its intent to promote violence in Central Asia, and over the past several months, the group has increased its propaganda aimed at appealing to regional peoples. And in April and May, ISKP claimed its first external attacks from Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover, claiming to have fired rockets from northern Afghanistan into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Now, both Uzbek and Tajik governments either denied or offered different explanations for these incidents, and the veracity of the claims are still unclear, but still, these developments are obviously worrying to neighboring countries. Also, these kinds of cross-border attacks sustain insecurity in Afghanistan and its border areas, and they undermine the Taliban's promise to prevent Afghanistan's exploitation by terrorist groups. Pakistan also reportedly conducted airstrikes in April against the TTP militants in Afghanistan as a result of the group's continued attacks in Pakistan. And then the Taliban themselves have continued to engage in controversial or even violent action along its borders, which has escalated tensions with its neighbors. So in May, the Taliban reportedly restricted movement along the Afghan-Tajik border and have been detaining Tajik truck drivers or seizing their trucks. And then in April, the Taliban reportedly had major clashes with border security forces of Iran and Pakistan. So certainly regional countries have become increasingly concerned about how actors in Afghanistan are threatening their security.
Going forward, what will we be watching for the security situation in Afghanistan?
So there are a few things to look for, but I'll mention two here. The first is the Taliban's ability to counter threats and secure the country. As I said before, one of the Taliban's most important claims is their alleged ability to bring about security following conflict, but they generally haven't been able to do so thus far. And so the Taliban are attempting to build up their military. They're trying to stand up some sort of an air force, and they have preemptively and are actively transporting fighters to hotspots. But despite months of efforts, they still haven't demonstrably degraded ISKP's capabilities to conduct major attacks in the country. So it'll be important to monitor changes in ISKP's activity and where it's primarily operating to assess the group's trajectory moving forward. Also, ISKP so far generally hasn't demonstrated the capability or near-term intent to seize and hold territory as it has done in the past, so monitoring changes on that issue remains important. And regarding anti-Taliban resistance forces, it'll be important to continue monitoring groups' activity, coordination, recruitment, and any international support they receive to get a better sense of their capabilities, especially because I think right now that's largely unclear. But this is going to be particularly important to monitor given these groups have more explicitly sought to challenge the Taliban's territorial control, primarily in the northeast. And then secondarily, it's important to keep an eye on how countries are responding given escalating threat perceptions in Afghanistan. As I said previously, probably the primary concern for neighboring countries will be limiting potential spillover of instability to their countries, but the trajectory of militant actors that present external threats is still a key priority, and ISKP claims to have conducted those attacks from Afghanistan to neighboring states. They've expressed an intent to continue to do so, so monitoring how countries respond to these issues, for example, with kinetic strikes, will help determine the trajectory of these threats and even Afghanistan's stability moving forward.
Well, thank you for that analysis, Isaia.
Thank you.
Isaia Galace is a global security analyst with RANE. Interested in following security challenges in Afghanistan? Well, RANE Worldview has you covered. We've accrued more than 20 years of analysis of Afghanistan's geopolitical situation. You can read them all when you subscribe. Right now, RANE has a special offer for subscribing. Visit RANEworldview.com. That's RANE worldview.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.